Thank you very much, Gabs. Hello, my name is Debbie Solomon, pronoun she, her, and I'm the Director of Synergy, which is a programme of work that focuses on the intersection of racial justice and mental health, and I'd like to thank you for joining our session. Synergy is led by and for racialised people with lived experience of mental ill health, trauma or distress. We recognise that the ways in which mental health is framed within the public imagination is grounded in Western and capitalist ideology, and as such is not inclusive of the experiences of racialised people who are the global majority. We will facilitate shifting experiences of racialised groups from the margins to the centre of the discourse of mental health. Mental ill health, distress or trauma is often caused by and or exacerbated by racial injustice and carceral forms of state violence. Our aim is for Synergy to support the work of groups at the forefront of challenging this and to effectively contribute to building collective memory and power on mental health and abolition. The support we provide will be co-created with the community, and as such, we will aim to be adaptive to meet the shifting needs. Our approach is to work in collaboration and to be transparent with how the work is delivered, successes and challenges, to ensure that we are a collective voice, to foster democracy and to be accountable to those who are doing the work at the local level. We are committed to refrain from prescribing what this work looks like, but rather supporting and facilitating dialogue within and between groups and collectives. It is vital that we do not perpetuate trauma, and as such, we will develop a safe space for our community to decompress, recharge, and to be resilient. Our values are rooted in and informed by Black feminist thought, which is to resist intersecting oppressions and ending social and economic injustices. Disability justice, which is a framework which embraces and values differences and centres those most impacted by capitalist systems, to be anti-racist and to not be extractive. It is important to acknowledge the harms that historic and current mental health practices can and do cause to racialised people, directly and indirectly as a community. The session today will be to unpack what abolition means in the context of racial justice and mental health. In this rich and informative discussion, we will hear from panellists who work at the local level with communities and grassroots collectives on what abolition looks like in practice, and how people are bringing abolitionist principles to providing care and practical support to those experiencing mental ill health, trauma and distress. There will be space to discuss and ask questions to our guests. I will now hand over to Jessica Pons, pronoun she, they, project manager at Synergy, to introduce the panellists.
Thank you, Debbie. Hi, everyone. So we've got three panellists with us today. One of them you can't see. They're here. It's Tipper. Their video is not working, though, so we can't spotlight them. But yeah, I'm really looking forward to today's discussion. I'm going to do my best at chairing so we can get the most out of having such brilliant speakers in the same room today. So after the discussion, we're going to have about 15 minutes for questions. We've got quite a long time today, so we'll see how much space we need. We've got 90 minutes. We might finish a bit earlier. We've definitely got to finish at 5 though. So I'd like to welcome Jerome Sewell, pronouns he, him, founder and managing director of Theatre Productions, who are funded by Synergy. You can find out more about them on our website. So Theatre Productions is an organisation that works with hospitalised ex-offenders and disadvantaged communities in London. Jerome's work is driven by his shared lived experience with the service users he works with, as well as being a social entrepreneur. He's a film producer and screenwriter and has worked for the Royal College of Psychiatrists as a service user representative, also for the Recovery College as a peer trainer, and as an expert by experience with the Royal Bethlehem Hospital. Jerome is also an article writer and has written mental health articles for Asylum magazine, Creek's Occupational Therapy Journal, and OT News. So I also welcome Tipper Naftali, he, him pronouns. As I said, we can't see him. And also he does have caring commitments today, so he may have to pop off. But yeah, he's really a valuable speaker, so we're really happy to have him here today. He is the founder of Catalyst for Change, campaigning group Forward Ever UK, and the National Mikey Powell Memorial Family Fund, amongst others. He's been involved in projects for over 28 years, spanning a wide range of subjects. He's now based in Birmingham, but remains active in using his skills and experience to support and develop a number of charities, justice campaigns, and other enterprises nationally. On Saturday, myself and Debbie had the pleasure of attending the first National Mikey Powell Memorial Family Fund Annual Gala Dinner and Campaigners Awards, and this was called 4021, and it was to commemorate 20 years since Mikey Powell's death in police custody and 40 years of inquest services, and also the first year of the awards. It was brilliant, incredibly moving and empowering in terms of thinking for Synergy about how to build a sustainable collective of grassroots groups working at this intersection. Now, last but not least, I welcome Misha Fraser-Carroll, pronouns she, her, the author of the brilliant book, Mad World, The Politics of Mental Health. This delves deeply into mental health from a radical political perspective, exploring the history of asylums and psychiatry, the relationship between disability justice, queer liberation and mental health, art and creativity, prisons and abolition, and alternative models of care. As well as being a writer, Misha works for Healing Justice London and is a trustee at NSUN. So welcome, all of you. So in our discussion today, we're going to be, first of all, we're going to be exploring what is abolition and why is it such a challenging topic to talk about. So there's a few questions around that, and then we'll be moving on to community alternatives. So first question, what is abolition and why is it relevant to how we think about mental health, distress and trauma? And I'm going to start with Tipper, if that's okay.
Okay, yeah. Can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Just one small correction to your introduction, Jess, of me. I actually spent 28 years living and working in London. But I've been working in the volunteer sector for over 40 years. So I just wanted to get that bit clear.
I made you seem way younger than you are.
Well, I'll thank you for that. Yeah,
You're very, very experienced. So, yeah.
So I think for me, the big issue about abolition in terms of mental health is a misunderstanding of what that means. A lot of people think it means that we want to completely do away with statutory services. In my interpretation, that's not the case. It's more about that some of the critical support services that are provided to people within our community, particularly people from marginalized communities and economically marginalized people, that we can actually provide a lot of these services for ourselves, which are much more intuitive, which are much more user-friendly, which are much more accessible, and actually developed with the individuals in mind. Statutory organizations simply cannot do that. And if they think they can, they're under illusion. We have to take back ownership of delivery of really critical community-based services from statutory organizations. We do it better. And for me, the broad context of abolition is within the context of what I've just outlined. That may differ for many others, but this is one of the issues I'm saying. Abolition can cause a lot of confusion and disagreement about what it means, but that is certainly how we, not just me, but how Catalyst for Change views the whole debate around abolition. And just one last point I would make, we have made similar calls in relation to the police in terms of deaths in custody. Many of you will have heard the term defunding the police. And again, a lot of people think that means we want to completely do away with the police entirely. That's not what defunding the police means. So there can be some misunderstandings about those two terms.
Thank you, Tipper. So you spoke about kind of replacing state services, but led by us. I might have interpreted that wrong, but that's kind of the gist that I got. I'm wondering, Misha or Jerome, is that what abolition means to you?
So I really agreed with Tipper's point about interpretation. Like, I think that there are a lot of misinterpretations of like what abolition can mean. And I think it's really important to acknowledge as well that it can mean lots of different things. I draw from in my book Angela Davis and lots of other Black women and women of color abolitionists. And she defines abolition feminism as a liberatory vision for a world free from all forms of violence, including those produced by carceral logics and systems of surveillance, policing, punishment, and exile, which I think is really interesting because I think that often when we hear like abolish or like abolition in mental health services, people think that it just means to get rid of, just straightforwardly get rid of. Whereas I think that that definition really draws out that we're talking about a lot, like a plurality of dynamics that are present within the mental health system. So if we're talking about surveillance, you know, we can see with the campaigns around Oxyvision, for example, surveillance is very present in services. Policing, there's so much overlap between police and our mental health services when people are sectioned, for example. But also Stop Sim, you know, that's another example of overlap between policing and the mental health system. Punishment is obviously very present when we see things like restraint, forced treatment, and exile, the other example from that Angela Davis definition. That's very present in institutionalization, you know, people being taken away from their communities and often even further secluded within the system. So I think that's like a definition that I really like of abolition. And I think for me, abolition is also around finding alternatives. Emily Reynolds has talked about this recently. She's a survivor who has talked about how people often think abolition means taking things away, when primarily it's, as the scholar Ruth Wilson Gilmore says, it's about presence. It's about creating more things, creating more options, more alternatives. It's about creating millions and millions of experiments that we can choose from. And as Tipper says, we can have more autonomy and community control over our care rather than kind of being controlled by state services. And then I guess like one other link I'd make is like a big part of abolition for me means not just looking at like these state systems, but looking at the broader conditions of our society and thinking about prevention. Like, how could we actually prevent so many people being pushed into the sharp end of the mental health system in the first place? How could we stop people from having these negative experiences within services in the first place, and creating a world where more of us are well?
Yeah, more of us are well, so we don't fall into the cracks where these services scoop us up. Yeah, thank you. Jerome, what does abolition mean to you in this context?
It's quite, this is very interesting. And what the last speakers just said, I agree strongly with parts of what they've said. I'm going to come at this from 2 or 3 different angles at the same time, to some extent. First of all, when you first kind of said that this would be the topic of the discussion, it got my mind going. And it brought me back to a memory, because I was sectioned and I was put in hospital. And during that time, I met an OT technician. Now, this guy was from a different European country. And it was so interesting speaking to him because his perspective over the mental health system and the way that the hospital was run at that particular time, it was just like, you don't fit in this place, the way you are and the things that you talk about. I never knew it at the time, but he described something to me and he said, if I had it my way, I would basically take off all of the restrictions. Now, I was in a forensic hospital, so the type of restrictions we're talking about are quite serious. You can't leave the hospital a lot of the time. If you go from one part of the hospital into another, you have to be escorted by a staff member. And yeah, there's all other kinds of restrictions surrounding that entire system. He said that if he had it his way, he would have abolished the entire restriction processes that exist in the hospital and have a kind of artistic environment where people would be able to walk in and out throughout the ward spaces and go to an art session and go to a music session and just do different things basically in free workspaces and artistic environments. I never knew it at the time, but actually when that memory came back to me, I realized some years later, I picked up on this guy was talking to me about a form of abolition, basically. That is what he was describing to me, and I never understood that at that particular point in time. And I do think, for me, there are two parts to this. That there are, yes, ways in which we should reform the system for both community and inpatient kind of care to make sure that the procedures are not so restrictive, are not so discriminatory, and that in the end, as has been said before, services are delivered by our own community to make sure that it can happen in a comfort zone. And actually, more importantly for me, in my context, or just as important, is that it's voluntary as well. The problem with the systems that we have in place at the moment, and I'm sorry, there are certain types of facilities that exist within the mental health system, which I will go to the full extreme, I guess, of the definition of abolition. I don't think certain things should exist that I've seen and come across. You have a situation kind of from the forensic perspective, actually, where people are, they have, and I think that this is not just true for forensics, but it has wider implications in forensics. People are basically, their capacity is taken away from them. The basis of which that capacity is taken away from them, actually, like sometimes can be formed on them simply being a free thinking agent and thinking differently. There are measures, like if somebody says, for example, I don't want to take medication, that can be used as a justification at the moment to just basically say to that person, well, you don't have capacity, when actually they may have formed that conclusion from quite a logical process of thinking in their own mind. And in that way, they're being denied actually the ability to say that they can, that they have the, that they are responsible enough to make their own decisions. And it is a type of restriction of freedom of thought, actually, that takes place in a lot of environments that are like this. Now, that, how do I put it? The way that that kind of system is orchestrated a lot of the time, it makes quite a mockery of fundamental liberties we're supposed to have, basically, as people in a free society. It's almost as though these rights that you believe, you know, at one stage in history we call inalienable rights, have actually been completely stripped of you. I've had friends that I've spent time in hospital with that when they've come out of hospital, gone through their recovery and everything, they haven't been allowed to see their children. The amount of distress that I experienced personally and that other people experienced whilst I was in hospital, and even ever since I've left hospital, because I still work with hospitalized ex-offenders and hear their experiences, it was so detrimental, basically. You see, the narrative at the moment is these services care for people and are there to help people and get people to recover. When actually, in reality, people don't factor in the damage that is caused by the trauma of institutionalization. And I've actually written about that before, because, you know, I'm not going to go too heavy into it, but, you know, you have people on hospital wards that are losing all hope, basically, turning into a condition where they become emotionally kind of unstable because of the environment they are in. They are in a harmful place. And I'm sorry, you see, I knew you were going to come to ask me the question, Jessica, and my mind was in two places at it, because yes, I do think there's an advantage to what that OT technician spoke about, of having a reform system, but with some sides of the system that I've seen, I don't believe some of them should exist. It's just not in the form that they exist. There are certain environments which are damaging people and damaging them for the long term, basically, even when they allegedly recover and come out.
Thank you, Jerome. And, you know, you've made a connection, you know, the forensic hospital system. You know, there's a real, when we hear about abolition, usually we hear about it in terms of prisons. Misha mentioned, you know, some great prison abolitionist speakers, and they do speak about mental health, psychiatry as well. But, you know, there is the connection, but also a distinction maybe between prison and psychiatric abolition. And I'm wondering if I can come back to you immediately, Jerome. Do you have anything to say on that?
No, yeah, this is a very interesting topic because Pete, I don't think it's not fully understood a lot of the time. Now, look, I went from a prison into a psychiatric hospital. That's a journey quite a lot of people go through. There are people that do get sectioned at the courts and then taken to a forensic unit. There are marked differences between the two systems, actually. The restrictions that are put on the person, you see, a prisoner still has their capacity to consent or not consent to treatment. So ultimately, you can prescribe a prisoner medication and they can choose to say no. They can't be restrained physically in that circumstance, which is why they take people from a prison a lot of the time into a forensic unit, because at that point, you can then exercise restraint procedures and do all of those that you can't do to someone who has capacity. So the element of having that element of having a legal right stripped of you is one thing. The other thing actually is the different types of sections that exist. So a section 4749 is for someone who is a prisoner serving a sentence, basically, who's been sectioned under the Mental Health Act. Then you have things like section 41, section 3741, and these involve the Home Office more specifically. Many people, you speak to people about this who have been on a section 41, and it's almost impossible, even across the whole duration of their life, to get off that section. When they come out, it's an entirely different thing. And apart from the fact that someone who's taken from, okay, there's just two very quick other points on this.
Yeah, sorry.
Prison,
I'll need to move on in a minute. Go
sorry?
on, yeah. Quick points, that's fine.
Yeah. A prison has a time span on it, usually, for most people's sentences. A section can be renewed time and time and again, which basically puts you in an entirely different situation of when you're coming out. The last thing that I would say is that in a hospital, you're in a contained environment. You then move from a hospital typically into care in the community, in a hostel a lot of the time. That's another controlled environment. And there's a whole trajectory to controlling someone's future ultimately, from the point of getting into a psychiatric hospital to leaving. And in prison, that doesn't exist. For better or for worse, you can chart your own future. And trying to chart your own future once being in the psychiatric system is something entirely different.
Yeah, and you're really speaking to the fact that psychiatry can be experienced as more carceral than the prison system. And when I worked in forensic hospitals, people would say to me, I'd rather be in prison. When your term is up. Yeah. Misha, I'm wondering if you have anything to say around the connections and distinctions between psychiatry and prisons.
Definitely, yeah. I was chiming with a lot of what Jerome said, and that's definitely a thing, that I've heard lots of people talk about, that, in prison, it's a process of counting down the days, whereas in psychiatric detention, it's often counting up. And I think, Debbie talked a bit at the beginning about anti-capitalism, and that's like really central to the way that I think about both prisons and the mental health system. So like taking a kind of anti-capitalist perspective and looking at the history of what used to be called lunatic asylums. So the system that incarcerated many, many people across Britain, mainly kind of having this big expansion in the 19th century. This system emerged to contain, warehouse, and control people who were disruptive to capitalism and disruptive to kind of the dominant societal order. And actually, I argue, I think that that's the primary function of prisons as well, is to contain people who are disruptive to the status quo. And I think that you see, as Jerome touched on, the people that both systems work upon, there's lots of overlap. It's also people who primarily have experiences, traumatic life experiences. They've experienced poverty, inequality, racism, hardship, trauma. There's huge overlap in those experiences in both systems. And as Jerome mentioned, lots of people who are psychiatrized are criminalized, and, the other way around. And I think an important point to name here is the importance of holding solidarity between these two groups. Because I think sometimes, you know, I've heard people say things when they're talking about the mental health system, saying, you know, I was treated like a prisoner, but like I committed no crime. And actually, I think that in both systems, there's so much overlap in the forces that people are subject to, that it's really important to hold that solidarity and think about those shared experiences. And yeah, lots of the same tools are obviously used in both systems, you know, restraint, seclusion, punishment. And I also think it's kind of been touched upon, like the fact that we're told a particular story about what prisons are for. You know, we're told that prisons fix the problem of violence and harm in our society. And similarly, we're told about psychiatry and the mental health system that it fixes the problem of suffering in our society. But in practice, as I mentioned, like, I don't think these are the primary functions or origins of either of these systems. It's not why they were established. They were established to manage people. And so I think that abolition in both contexts kind of means creating new infrastructures that are genuinely fit for purpose and genuinely fulfill those stated aims. And then I think it's a distinction, or maybe just like a thing, like a nuance worth pointing out when it comes to psychiatric abolition and abolition in mental health, is that I think when it comes to talking about abolition in mental health and psychiatry, there can be these misapprehensions that it's like we're just talking about biological approaches, you know, and people will often say kind of in response, well, actually, I like taking meds, and actually, you know, that's something that I want to keep, or I actually had a positive experience. And so I think it's important to hold that there's a vision of abolition that allows for a plurality of approaches, allows for people to take medication, it allows for people to go to therapy if they want to go to therapy. You know, there's lots of debates obviously in our community about illness framings, and some people really, really don't like the framing of illness, but also holding that if people want to have that framing, that's also valid and an okay framing too. And so I kind of want to name, I feel like that's a real nuance when we're talking about psychiatric abolition, and something that, yeah, I guess there's a very good book that came out last year called Health Communism, where the authors talk about the need for all care for all people. And that's, I think, really what is at the heart of abolition in psychiatry for me, is creating a world where that's a reality, and we don't just have this one narrow approach that's enforced on everyone.
Yeah, I think understanding the history can help us traverse the future, traverse the present as well. And yeah, there being informed choice around, and actual choices in terms of how you do receive care. I think that's very important, because often, well, there's many people that don't think that there are alternatives to biological psychiatry. So yeah, is that a real choice? It's the question. Tipper, you do brilliant work in terms of this intersection between prison and psychiatry, and I'm wondering if you can speak. Oh, yeah, we see you now.
Yeah, my camera decided to switch back on again, so I don't know how long that will last. I can't really add much more to what Jerome and Misha have said. I mean, they're spot on, and they've said a lot of the things I would have said maybe in a slightly different way, but same language. What I always say is it's the same language, a different accent. But what I would add is, yes, you know, I agree, there's definitely a link there. Now, we have done quite a bit of work over the years with organizations like Inquest, the Howard League for Penal Reform, and so on and so on, Prison Reform Network and so on. Because, and Pauline Campbell, bless her, she's not with us anymore, but Pauline Campbell's daughter was a vulnerable woman with mental health, who kind of drifted in and out of mental health illness and psychosis and so on and so forth. She shouldn't have been in prison in the first place. So we have been arguing for a long, long time that there needs to be a diversion kind of strategy in place so that vulnerable people, regardless, I mean, obviously, if it's a low-level crime that they've committed, some of the women, for example, that were in Holloway were there for non-payment of their TV license and separated from their children. I mean, come on. And many of them were women who had never offended before. So Pauline Campbell argued really strongly in Parliament, outside of prisons, that this is just not necessary. And so Holloway prison, for example, I think large chunks of Holloway prison now have been shut down or entirely shut down. I've lost track a little bit. But Pauline was responsible for changing that practice in that particular prison. In Birmingham, for example, Winson Green Prison, I think now it's called something else, I can't remember, but I know it as Winson Green Prison. My brother spent time in there. Many of my brethren in the community have spent time in there. And for us, and many of them didn't need to be in prison to sort out the issue that got them there in the first place. They were relatively low-level crimes, or they were they got longer sentences than their white counterparts for similar sorts of offences. So we have when Mark Duggan was killed, and we had the uprisings across the country, there are men and women in prison still today for looting. And I mean, that was what, 7, 8, 9 years ago? So for us, one of the things that we do at Catalyst, we have a project called, the acronym is MASH, and it stands for the Mentoring and Advocacy Support Hub. And in fact, its main 4 principles are based on the way that my cousin, who was killed by the police, lived his life. Now, this was a man who had a 17-year history of psychosis, mental health breakdowns, depression, and so on. He wasn't known to the system. He refused to get pulled into the mental health system because he'd seen so many other people like him, Black men predominantly, disappear down a black hole in the mental health system, then into prison, and then back out into the mental health system again, and the cycle continued. And he didn't want that. So he had a really strict regime of exercise and socializing with people. He had a job. He held down that job for many years. All of these things helped to keep him well. He had something to get up for in the morning. So MASH is based on that principle. And we think it's really important. Jerome mentioned prevention, critical. And that's what we do at MASH. We work with the men and women who are vulnerable, build up their capacity to retrain in skills that they already had before they became ill, so they can get back into the job market. We talk to fair-minded employers who will give them opportunities in their companies, and so that they don't come into contact with the criminal justice system in the first place. The only reason Mikey came into contact with the criminal justice system was because he was having a psychotic episode. That was it. And if something like MASH was around when Mikey was alive, perhaps he would not have been outside on that night smashing up his own car. He wasn't causing damage to the public infrastructure or to anybody else's property. He had a psychotic episode and was smashing up his own car. He was actually arrested for causing criminal damage to his own car. And this is where the criminal justice system goes, is completely irrational. So prevention and support is key for us to stopping people getting into the criminal justice system, the mental health system in the first place. And one last thing I would say, and again, this is touching on something that Jerome mentioned. Jerome, when you were talking about the technical guy or whatever you were speaking to when you were, I'll say incarcerated, because that's essentially what they did to you. And he was talking about, you were talking about this artistic environment. We are actually going to develop that. So one of the things that Catalyst has a plan to do is to build a large housing complex with private flats in them, but with 24-hour staffing. And all the people in that complex will have that shared experience of having been through the mental health system. So they will have their independence, they'll have their own flat, but there will be people in staff 24 hours a day, some of them living in. There will be activities happening in the building. And also we will bring practitioners that they work with in the community into the building to deliver the services. And we've tested this with a number of so-called service users. I hate that term, but I'll use it for the purposes of this meeting. And they all say, please do it and do it quick. These are the sorts of facilities that we need to stop us ending up in this revolving door, which Misha talked about a little earlier. That's all I'll say for now.
Thank you, Tipper. And you started already talking about alternatives to the current system, and that's the thing. Like with abolition, it's not just about burning things down; it's about building new infrastructures and reimagining what can be. But yeah, I think both prison and psychiatry need health justice responses. And yeah, the history is so similar, and yeah, I think synergy straddles both. But yeah, abolition, I mean, maybe I've given it away. Why do you think there's resistance to the idea of abolition? Misha, I'll go to you.
Yeah, I guess like there's resistance from different places, right? Like resistance from the top down, I guess, because why would services and the state want to give more power and control and autonomy to psychiatrists, people, mad people, using mad in the reclaimed sense, survivors? I think that any sort of uprooting and like revolution, like there's always going to be resistance to that from the top down. But I also think just from like conversations that I have with people with lived experience, I think it is that thing that I touched on earlier of abolition. I think especially maybe in an era of like neoliberal austerity, people are worried about abolition meaning taking more away from people without anything in its place. And so I think it's really important to emphasize that it's about creation. It's about us having tailored hyper-local responses that are really, really tailored to the individual, and having many different options. And to bring it explicitly into the room, I think, that includes Indigenous healing practices, cross-cultural approaches that have been dismissed by our current system as not real science, or as forms of madness. I think it includes those and community approaches, of course. And yeah, I think emphasizing that thing that it's about presence and not absence is really important. Yeah.
I'm so keen to go off on a tangent a little bit here, but I don't know, I'm going to. Just kind of like, yeah, I suppose maybe we need to be mindful of not replicating services, but with a black face, making them appropriate and using Indigenous healing. Because if we're using white tools, will they be useful? And yeah, that kind of makes me think about reform in the context of mental health and non-reformist reform and working with systems and kind of the tension there. And I'm wondering, Jerome, could you talk about that?
Yeah, sorry, I was just having an issue unmuting then. So yeah, look, I think when it comes to the issues of the societal tensions and the more general kind of question that you were asking, there's a much wider problem, I think, in two ways. There is a societal problem and a stigma problem, basically, around mental health itself and what it means to have a mental health condition. And what that almost makes you as a person. I come across a lot of dehumanization, a lot of people being made to feel that they are less than, particularly in the context of what has been spoken of, kind of a capitalist society where there are rankings in society, there are levels basically, and
if you don't fit within those levels, or you're somewhere at the bottom of those levels, you are treated in a certain way and looked at in a certain way. Now, when tackling that wider kind of misconception, which a lot of it does come, some of it is a prejudice, but a lot of it is ignorance, actually, and not understanding certain things. And it comes down to, I think, two different parts of this. People actually who have mental health conditions putting themselves forward as representatives, basically, in different parts of industries, different parts of our society, to actually break down that stigma. And how do I put it? There's a stigma that comes from wider society. There's a stigma that comes from people, particularly within the system itself, a lot of the time, where they have a particular perspective. They've worked with hundreds of people, sometimes thousands of people. My mom's a probation officer, so even in that system, and what it is there tends to be a type of profiling that comes about, basically, when you see someone come through your door. And it actually takes kind of examples and individuals, basically, not fitting that profile, breaking that mold in order to break the misconception overall. And then the last thing I'll say about this is I was told something when I was very young at the time, must have been about 10. And I was walking back from school, primary school, with my father, and he turned around and he said something to me that actually many young Black men and women will have heard probably from their parents or grandparents. He said, look, you're going to have to work 5 times harder as a young Black man to make it in life. That's basically what he said to me at the age of 10. And now imagine being, he didn't know my future at that point. So now imagine being a young Black man or a Black man or Black woman. Then on top of that, being an ex-offender in kind of the circumstances that I work in and those who I work in, and then being hospitalized as well and having a psychiatric condition. How far do you actually have to climb, actually, for people to begin to have that respect for you, which the conditions of our society are based upon in terms of how we give people respect? That's about changing the values by how we value other human beings and look at them. And that also requires other people basically setting examples and being representatives to say that, listen, you've got it wrong. Yeah, I have a mental health condition, but actually I'm striving, I'm capable, I'm all of these other things that you for some reason don't believe I can be. And a lot of the time, the very final point now, when it comes specifically homing back into your question about why there's so much kind of, why this is not looked on favorably by elements of the system. The thing is, it's kind of like, unless you come with a certain skill set, level of experience, qualifications, whatever things people use to judge, in the end, you won't be taken as seriously as other organizations, other things, and other people. And I think you have to change the value systems. You also need representatives who actually have the standing and also the reputation and experience to basically challenge the pre-existing ways of looking at things and dealing with things.
I've definitely found kind of mentorship from elders in the community as, you know, it's nothing's been like it. But when you were talking, I was just thinking of disability justice and the marginalization that people in the forensic system or forensic hospitals have, not only, especially if you're racialized, the whole like mad, black and dangerous perception. I mean, you get that even if you don't have a if you don't have a prison history, that is how people are talked about, stereotypes. And it's just, really, really hard. I'm sure we all here share that kind of talk from your parents as well, and I wanted to kind of give the nod to that. But yeah, Tipper, I saw you making some notes. Do you have anything to?
Yeah, I won't say too much. But why are they wary? Why is the state wary about about this. And I do sometimes tend to explain these things in really simple terms and based on practical experience. So in a lot of the conversations I've had with senior trust managers within the NHS and local government, they think that we can't do it well. In a very simplest form, they think we will budget up if we deliver services. So what we've done is prove them wrong. You know, if that's their practical position, we've proved them wrong by practical application. So the development of MASH, for example, saw an immediate diversion of people who were regularly going to see their CPNs, their community psychiatric nurses, who were seeing their medication being decreased, lowered, all because they were attending our services. They became much more productive. We had one young man who had a mental health issues, but was also autistic. And he used to come to our sessions, our drop-in sessions, and literally stay in the corner for the whole 3.5-hour session with his headphones on, just kind of rocking away like that, not participating. By the end of the project, I mean, we only had funding for 3 years. He was a productive member. He would come early, set up all the tables and everything else, and be participatory. And there was a definite improvement in his overall well-being and performance. So we've already proved in Birmingham that people with lived experience can run and deliver services really well and better than the trust. And the National Family Fund, the event you came to on Saturday, when people die in state custody, whether that be prison, mental health, prison custody, police custody, or immigration detention, families often call out for a lot of help around counselling, personal welfare. The state didn't deliver. And many of those families then who had no prior history of mental illness started to exhibit signs of mental illness because of the distress related to the death of their loved one and the fact that they were not getting any support around counselling or anything like that from state or public bodies. So we said, okay, you don't want to do it, we'll do it. And we've been running the Family Fund since 2015, and we've helped over 400 families access counselling, welfare, support, put them in touch with other families. You talked about mentoring, Jess. Put them in touch with mentors, families who have experienced these deaths many, many years ago, like the family of David Rocky Bennett, for example. And last thing I would say is there is this development now called PCREF, the Patient Carers Race Equality Framework. And we worked with Synergy, the old Synergy, to develop the National Pledge, which many of the mental health trusts around the country have signed. And that in that document, they have to commit themselves to certain changes that need to take place within their institution. They've signed it. And once, if anyone who knows me, once you sign something, I've got you. And I'm not going to let you off the hook. So Catalyst have been working very closely with the trust, the Mental Health Trust and other public institutions based on the Race Equality Framework and also the pledge so that they honor their agreement. And part of that agreement is about handing resources to community organizations to deliver some of the services that they delivered, but in a culturally appropriate way. So you made the important point earlier, Jess, about not just running organizations using the old model. They've got to be imprinted with ethical, race appropriate approaches to delivering services. It can't be the same old, just with a black face. So I think they're scared. They're scared that we won't do a good job of it. There's lots of other deeper political reasons, but on the surface, that's one of them that's mentioned to me all the time. And we're proving them wrong. Street triage in Birmingham would never have happened if the police and the mental health trust and the ambulance service hadn't partnered with Forward Ever UK. It just wouldn't have happened. And that saw a massive decrease in controversial deaths in custody after the death of Mikey and Kingsley Burrell. So we've proved in the West Midlands that if we have control of services, we will do a better job, we will save taxpayers' money as well, and we will allow these, give these people, the people affected, a much more productive future. One last thing I would say is that lots of people have seen on TV the cases of police officers who are now in prison for murdering, raping and murdering women, beating up their husbands, killing a famous footballer in the West Midlands. This is all on public display now. And they know, these institutions know that the public are now getting fed up of the poor practice and that there are other people, and namely us, who can deliver better support for people so that they don't end up in the hands of the criminal justice system in the first place.
Thank you, Tipper. I mean, you're giving a really good example of work on the ground that has led to real changes within services. And I'm wondering if your kind of initiatives began as what we call non-reformist reform, like steps that can take you towards real change. But then you also have like really kind of new, small initiatives taking place, and I suppose maybe more alienated from kind of wider networks. And yeah, I think that, does abolition differ from reform? Is it helpful to have this dichotomy between true abolition and reform?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure how to answer that. But what I would do is read a short quote from Susan Berger, an activist and writer, when she talked about what is it that drives people to deliver services that are better than the state can provide. But this was in particular reference to people who have lost someone to the state. And what she says, and this is certainly the case in my case, and many of the people you met on Saturday, Marcia Rigg, Lee Lawrence, Stafford Scott, right? It's their personal experience as drove them to deliver really effective services in their community. And what Susan said was, what is an activist? It's someone who responds to the core issues that cause the bereavement, embellishing the purpose, but seeking remedy to ensure the loss was not in vain. And that is what, sometimes people do not understand the complex arguments and the terminologies that we're even using in this meeting. And so that simple statement that I've just read out makes sense to a lot of the families that we work with. And we help them to set up initiatives. So the Family Fund has funded the development of small projects in local areas, probably about 40 or so over the last 7 or 8 years, right? And the people who are accessing those services were previously accessing other services in the community that are not appropriate. And it's making a huge difference. So yeah, I can't answer the complex question that you asked, but my simple rationale for why we do it better, and the case for abolition is the statement that I've just read out. We lived experience drives people to develop excellence in service provision. I've seen that so many times. That's all I'll say on that for now.
Thank you, Tipper. So we're kind of running out of time a little bit. We've got half an hour left, but I'd like to get some questions. So we have muddled things up a little bit. We've spoken about community alternatives already. Tipper's given some brilliant examples. But I'm wondering, Jerome or Misha, what are some good examples of things being done in communities as alternative forms of care to statutory services? Is it possible to kind of like there are some really great alternatives in the States, maybe here we're a little bit behind in terms of healing justice initiatives. But I'm wondering, Misha, Jerome, could you speak to some alternatives within the UK?
Definitely. One thing I think that is important to name as well is like, I think so much survivor and service user work now and historically hasn't been explicitly named as abolitionist, but it's actually like all the same things that we've been talking about today: increasing community control, autonomy, consent in mental health support. And so, yeah, I think a lot of the groups that NSUN supports and works with, I've always been really inspired by the Hearing Voices Network. I think there was some chat in the Zoom chat about, you know, challenging our ideas of what it means to be productive or thriving. And I see the Hearing Voices approach as really central to that, like carving out a different conception of what it means to hear voices or see visions, and the fact that actually that doesn't have to mean that there's something wrong, that doesn't have to be seen as an illness. That's could be one way of thriving as well. And again, that overlaps so much with different cross-cultural perspectives. And I think, you know, the work that's been done in a lot of crisis houses is a really good example, you know, non-carceral, non-punitive residential places where people can voluntarily go and stay if they want to when they're in crisis. The Campaign for Psych Abolition, I think, is doing really good community work. They're quite informed by like anarchist approaches, and I think they do a really good job of, like, they have guides to how to set up your own kind of community care crisis team in your local area. And I think that's like really inspiring, saying to people, you know, anyone can do this. It doesn't just hinge on kind of the forms of expertise that have been glorified historically and today. And yeah, maybe to draw on like some historical examples as well. For my book, I looked a lot at the Mental Patients Union, which started in Scotland, and then there was one set up in London. And, you know, they drew up a manifesto which called for an end to things like forced treatment, and lots of these other demands that we see abolitionists making today. And again, you know, they didn't use the language of abolition. It was different language, but it was really kind of the same work and the same vision. Yeah.
Thank you, Misha. I mean, both you and Tipper are talking about language, and yeah, I think sometimes we can use long words to mean simple things, and I think that can be quite alienating. So there's a piece of work to be done on language, but also the archiving of work that's gone before. And, you know, this work has happened forever, but sometimes it's spoken about as if it's quite new. And one of our work streams is going to be archiving work that's gone before, which is quite exciting.
And I just add, I think it's like very similar for police and prison abolition as well. It's like, especially in Black communities, like we've known forever that police harm our communities. Like we've always looked for alternatives to calling the police and things like this. And that's really long-standing work that like we're creating new language for now.
Jerome, do you have anything to add around kind of good examples of things being done in communities, or kind of how we support and build on these alternatives?
Yeah, so just a few things. I'm sorry I have my camera off. It's just I had to put my device on charge. So just very briefly off the offset, because when I come to a forum, I come in the capacity that I usually come in. So I've come from therapeutic productions on this side. What you've asked me persuades me to invoke another side of my work, which is that I work for an organization that works with young offenders. So I will draw on both things in terms of what I say with this. I think from experience in the kind of the psychiatric sector, I mean, lived experience models that are used, like the Recovery College, I think are quite transformational actually to the way that those services are being developed and used. Whilst I think we have to remember a lot of the time, and I kind of lean on something called the person-centered approach when it comes to this, and the strengths-based approach, which is that you have to look at what people's needs are actually.
Like, what do they want to see out of their life and what do they want to accomplish? And then model services around things that achieve that. So in the case of things like the recovery colleges that I've worked with and been around, like they train people from the mental health system to become lived experience practitioners. They learn how to develop courses, deliver workshops. It facilitates shared learning, peered learning, and it's really quite empowering for those who do become what is called a peer trainer, because they basically become a type of professional. And for a lot of people that I meet basically and that I work with, restoring their dignity and self-esteem, like in terms of their roles in society and who they are in the different capacities that they can be in, is quite an important thing. The other thing, which kind of leans more on all of my work, really, is the need to cater for people's aspirations and to deliver services that cater for people's aspirations as a vehicle towards it. So people have dreams, whether that be in the form of a job. For someone else, it actually could just be to live a peaceful life and be spiritually fulfilled. That can take many, many shapes and forms. But making sure that there are basically services that either do it through mentoring practices, which I've seen before, where a mentor will guide someone to reaching their ultimate ambitions and goals. If it's a career-based kind of objective and goal, then getting people to basically take part in employment packages, which lead them to kind of taking on long-term skills, also taking the first steps to getting the particular career that they want to get. Like I said, that's usually done through training courses and that kind of thing, and there are different models for that. The very last thing, which probably is massively important kind of in therapeutic productions work and situation, is empowering people basically to tell their own stories and their own narratives. And the ability to tap into arts in particular, like music, film, writing, as a way to kind of express your experiences, redefine your experiences, and actually come to terms with your experiences in different ways by creating your own narrative. You see, a part of this problem is that sometimes people, their name comes up in a newspaper or it comes up somewhere else. They're constantly being fed labels, basically, of what they are, and giving them the ability to, I guess, create their own label through whatever artistic means they wish to use to do that is an incredibly empowering thing. And that's, a lot of that is based on narrative therapy, which is based on existentialism, based on the idea that we are the stories that we tell ourselves, and we are the stories that other people tell about us, and giving people that voice basically to say who I am to the world and define themselves actually is a massive part of recovering, dealing with trauma, rebuilding self-esteem, rebuilding confidence, and moving forward. And so in whichever ways we can get people to tell stories in that kind of way is beneficial. Very final thing, the arts in our communities in terms of, so I'm from an Afro-Caribbean community. It's also quite true for African communities, have a lot of African friends and African relatives as well. We have formed informal and formal institutions on our arts. Music is massive throughout our community. When you're young, basically, you'll go after school. I don't know, you might go to a friend's house, start recording a hip hop track if that's the kind of thing you're into, or sing at our churches. That also takes place as well. Music has become an institution that gathers people into basically taking part in a form of art. Now, using that institution to tap people into services is an access point. An example of this is, Therapeutic Productions last week, we went to an estate in Clapham, quite difficult estate, long history in this kind of thing. And we were able to basically engage young people in creating music around the subject of mental health. But at the same time as doing that, We also brought an arts therapist down, very good. And she delivered drama therapy exercises, getting young people to explore characters, explore emotions. The young people said at the end of the session, if we could extend any of the activities we took part in, we would extend the therapy. That was used. We delivered therapy in an entirely different way to to basically tap young people into that for the benefits of their mental health. Use our own institutions as gateways to our own community.
Yeah, and you're talking about narrative therapy, you know, it's done well, narrative therapy can be brilliant, and you know, it's a real reclaiming of our stories, you know, and it involves politics. And I think, yeah, the ways that we heal ourselves have to be appropriate. You know, it's not just providing services, any services, and yeah. Anyway, I'm waffling. But yeah, I'm gonna come to questions now, if that's okay. I just wanted to say though, like to keep the space feeling safe enough, please, if you are unmuting, and I'll ask you to, could questions be short-ish? We've only got 20 minutes left, and also like just be mindful of how they might land, especially if you're not coming from a racialized background. So can I see who is in the room? Does anybody want to ask a question? If you put your hands up, yeah, put your hands up.
There's a question in the chat, Jeff, just to let you know.
Do you want to read it out?
Yeah, sure. This came from Courtney Booker, and it was on the back of what Misha had said. And really appreciate space to think through psych and prison abolition. Misha, you spoke about the need to build solidarity between psych and prison abolition, including a sensitivity around language. I was treated like a criminal. Do you or any of the panelists have ideas about how we can better build solidarity between psych and prison abolition? Question, including what we can do or things we can stop doing in psych abolition, e.g. Misha, you spoke about the dangers of sentiments like I was treated like a criminal in psych organising.
Yeah, definitely. I think I'd mostly speak to movement building, like working together across movements. So, you know, that could be a range of different things, like even doing skill shares, I think can be useful for this kind of thing. Like I hear a lot of people talking about prison and police abolitionists, seeing someone in mental health crisis or someone who they think appears to be unwell and like calling the police on them, or seeing them being arrested and not intervening and things like this. And I think that it can be really overlooked actually in like some spaces that do consider themselves more broadly to be abolitionist. And so I think if there's an opportunity like to come together and share, for example, skills in terms of, you know, what are non-carceral ways to respond to someone who's in crisis, you know, what are the techniques that we use to kind of enhance the skills of police and prison abolitionist groups. I also think, you know, working together on campaigns and things. So for example, I think Stop Sim was a really good example of that. Like I saw so many people again who are familiar with prison abolition and police abolition, you know, finding out about Sim and being like, oh my God, like why are there police involved in mental health crisis response? Like they didn't know anything about it. And I think that was a really good jumping off point for people to connect those two struggles. And also a good jumping off point for us involved in survivor service user work to say, well, actually, even if we take police out, these services are still harming people in many ways. And so, yeah, I think that was like a good opportunity for consciousness raising. And then I also think kind of always being mindful of when we can include one another in our work and our campaigning. So, for example, the organization Inquest, which works around deaths in state custody, you know, a lot of their work is about deaths in police custody, but actually they include people who also have died in mental health detention. And I know like the United Family and Friends campaign, which is a group that does work around family and friends of people who have died in state custody. They do the same thing. They include anyone who has lost someone in state custody. And I think that's allowed people involved in those campaigns to really start like making the links between their experiences and seeing that there's a lot of shared ground there. So yeah, I guess I'd say just thinking about where are those opportunities for us to overlap and remain in dialogue and in movement.
Thank you, Misha. Tipper, I know you're heavily involved in this. Would you like to say anything to that question? Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry, I was so engrossed in what Misha was saying there. I forgot my mute was, I had to unmute myself. I can't really say much more than Misha has already said. I mean, we provide opportunities throughout the year for different abolitionist kind of disciplines to come together and talk about and share and explore how we can work much more collaboratively towards the same goal. So one of the things that we're going to be doing next year, when I say we, I'm talking about the National Memorial Family Fund, in conjunction with the United Families and Friends campaign, is to have regular, I think there'll be 3 monthly, open Zoom chats like this one. You don't, you can just click and get involved, where we want to get practitioners on abolitionist issues, on defunding the police issues, talking, but not just talking. Because one of the things that really frustrates me is that I go to so many events and people take my card and, yeah, we've got to work together, and never hear from them again. But there's some work we need to do within the campaigning community itself to be a lot more disciplined about taking forward promises to work together. Because for me, there's far too much disunity within the campaigning community itself, which is damaging the cause, which is damaging the fight. And we often get pulled apart by funding regimes. And so, which is why the Family Fund doesn't take any funding from any formal bodies like the lottery or anybody else. There can be a culture in funding which sets groups against each other rather than with each other. So the chats that we're going to be organizing next year will be open forum, anybody can attend. We will publish the dates and you can just click a link and get involved. And it will be primarily aimed at activists and campaigners within those disciplines that Misha has already outlined. We need to do more. We need to talk more and follow it up with action.
Yeah, solidarity. I echo that definitely. So we've had a question from Joy, asking the panel to comment on the creation of personal narratives through whichever artistic media, and then them being co-opted by others, so that people who are encouraged in their personal narrative creations are then sorry, I'm interpreting this a little bit, but like then their narratives are used by those who are in positions of power. And they gave an example of this happening in Australia. Does that make sense? So those like narratives being co-opted. Are there any comments on that?
I mean, yes, I mean, something that, yeah, that's a very, I think, important point, actually. That when these stories get created, whilst it's a personal journey for the individual, actually, it can have wider benefits, actually, to those who have influence. There, in other kind of sectors, there's another organization called the Black Studies something. I'll have to find their name. But what they do basically is they train school teachers on how to understand the Black experiences in Britain. Now, that's important because they're training those who are going to be teaching our children how to be culturally sensitive, helping them to eliminate elements of bias. I use that as an example because it probably matches something that Therapeutic Productions is doing at the moment, which is that we're making a film. And when we went into the process of making that film, we kind of linked up with a lot of mental health associations, so like the Association of Drama Therapists, Mindfulness UK, the Restorative Justice Council. And the idea was that if you get these practitioners involved in this process effectively, when the film goes out, the narrative that is being shared will be understood by practitioners. And therefore they will understand other people's stories, and they will understand how better to treat people who are going through certain life circumstances and gain a greater understanding of them. That takes a collaborative effort. You have to really, and the thing is, a lot of these associations, there are key individuals a lot of the time that are very receptive to hearing these kind of stories and these kind of things. And as long as you get the right person and do the right partnership building, you can kind of make sure that these narratives travel further and have a greater, more systemic impact.
Thank you, Jerome. But yeah, I suppose services can also be gatekept quite a lot, and access not always given, and also stories co-opted in ways that aren't helpful. I'm sorry that we can't spend more time on this, because I think the co-option of services, the co-option of peer support, say as an initiative that's supposed to be quite powerful and in disrupting the status quo, you know, they aren't always rolled out like that. And I think this goes back to kind of something I was saying around like culturally appropriate services. You know, it can't just be the status quo rolled out for Black people or people of colour. We need real alternatives. Yeah. And then Eva is just commenting that being a person of colour in an organisation, being relied on to make changes and educate is really difficult. And that's another topic that we can talk about for a very long time. I want to, with 10 minutes left, I'm wondering if the panelists have any closing comments of just like very short ones.
The only thing that I would say is I do recognize some. I'm just looking through all the kind of screens, and I do recognize some of the faces I've seen here. And you know, we just have to keep just plugging away, right? You know, nothing ever happens quickly. We know this. And I think, you know, I've seen so many organizations and people just drop away because they're just tired and they give up. And I think that's partly because the peer support that we as a community, a campaigning community, is not always there. So I would say keep plugging away, keep networking, get involved in the UFFC network online thing I mentioned earlier. It will be publicized in the new year, and I'll share it with you, Jess, and for people who have attended this. But yeah, don't give up. Don't give up the fight. We've all heard that. The great late Robert Nesta Marley. Don't give up the fight.
Thank you, Tipper. Misha, any closing comments?
I would just really build on that to say, like, I think we have to carry on. I think that, as some people have like acknowledged in the chat, I've just been reading throughout, like, while a lot of these ideas, like, they are radical, also a lot of them are just like really common sense. And I think that that's one thing that I've learned, like, doing this book, because it's really been aimed at like more of like a mainstream audience who is not familiar with this topic. To a lot of people, they're actually very open to these ideas and these arguments. As we've mentioned, like, I think sometimes people are put off by language, or like they, I don't know, find it difficult when you start talking about abolition, but actually these ideas make a lot of sense. And we see, like, even people who work within these services are talking about the fact that these services aren't working and that they fail a lot of people. And I think this is one thing I say in the book, is like, abolition is often framed as chaos and disorder, but actually the current reality that we have is very chaotic and very disorderly, and actually produces a lot of harm and trauma. And I think the possibility to create something else and to use our imaginations to do something different, I think that that's a really exciting possibility and something that I'm really hopeful about.
Thank you, Misha. And Jerome, just a sentence or something, if you want.
Yeah, I simply have a question, not a question, sorry, a request actually. There are a lot of great ideas and great things that are being trialed and done in the community, basically. Let us please, actually, if we are going to make this more widespread, whether that's national or regional, we have to find the mechanisms and structures to doing it. And I would value Synergy and the Survivors Network finding a systemic framework of how we really do it in all levels, basically, to make these ideas widespread across communities.
Thank you, Jerome. And yeah, working together with established organisations, I think, is going to be key for us. But yeah, if you're interested in Synergy, please do go to our website, synergyproject.org.uk, and sign up to the newsletter, because we kind of distribute news and kind of opportunities through there, and there will be a write-up about Tipper's event and good stuff like that. So yeah, thank you, everybody. And I think, sorry, just quickly, I think Misha was speaking about like people in systems really struggling with, you know, saying that things aren't working. And I've worked with many professionals in systems who are really burnt out and struggling. No, it's not working. And I think there's something to be said around going at the system rather than going at people, and like bringing people with us. So as well as solidarity between movements, there's also something around, yeah, how do we not criticize too much, but criticize enough, but also make people want to join in? You know, we need to grow our movements as well. Okay, so thank you, everyone. I want to also signpost you to the earlier sessions that happened today. There was one on radical peer support, which was fab, and also on surveillance and carceral care, stuff that's really integral to the way that Synergy is working. Yeah, so as I said, please sign up to the newsletter. And we're also on Twitter, or what is now X, at Synergy Project. So thanks for coming. You will receive a survey when you exit the meeting. If you'd give us some feedback, that'd be fab. So yeah, thank you so much. And to our wonderful speakers, Tipper, Misha and Jerome, and our interpreters, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you all very much for having us. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Tipper.
Thank you. All right, see you.